In 1989, students in China led demonstrations calling for fundamental freedoms and protesting corruption in the government and the ruling Communist Party. On June 3rd and 4th, China's communist rulers sent troops and tanks to Tiananmen Square, the epicenter of the demonstrations. They opened fire on the unarmed protesters. How many protesters and how many bystanders did they kill? Hundreds, maybe thousands. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, suppressed information about the slaughter. This week, the 36th anniversary of these events, I thought it would be instructive to ask how the Tiananmen Square massacre changed China's trajectory and its relations with the U.S. and with the other countries of the Indo-Pacific and with the West in general. And who better to ask than Matt Pottinger? Matt served in the White House for 4 years in senior roles on the National Security Council, including as Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021. More than anyone else, he raised awareness about Beijing's true intentions and ambitions, a subject about which too many people were misinformed or deluded or self-deluded. Before his White House service in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Matt was a reporter for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal in China. He then joined the U.S. Marines and fought in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2007 and 2010. Today, among other tasks, we're proud to say he chairs FDD's China program. I'm Cliff May, and I'm pleased you're joining us for this conversation here on Foreign Policy. Well, Matt, welcome. Always great to see you.
It's really great to see you.
Before we begin, just a note to the FDD community. Claudia Rosette, you said I think you'd met her but didn't know her particularly well.
I was an admirer.
So all right. So she covered the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, and massacre as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. One of the few Western reporters present in Beijing during the crackdown and provided firsthand accounts. She wrote a detailed account titled "The Communist Party Pulls the Trigger." That was published June 5th, 1989. She described the protests as confronting the soldiers who brutally slayed the protesters. Her reporting is a significant record of those events, and she received an Overseas Press Club award. She went on, and this I'm proud to say, she served as journalist in residence here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies from 2003 to January 2016. She was here 13 years with us, and she was renowned for her investigative reporting on international affairs, notably her expose on corruption within the UN Oil for Food program. And she had a reputation as a fearless journalist committed to uncovering often very complex global issues. She could follow the money and getting policymakers and legislators to understand and act. And sadly, she passed away 2 years ago. And I just have to also mention, Richard Bernstein, you said you met him one time. So he was Time Magazine's first correspondent in Beijing. And then he joined the New York Times in 1982. And like every reporter coming on board those days, even though he'd already been a foreign correspondent, he had to do a stint on the Metro desk, covering New York City. And for his sins, he found himself sitting next to me. And I was also, before getting shipped to Africa. And he was just a brilliant guy and a good friend of mine. He became UN bureau chief, Paris bureau chief, national cultural correspondent, book critic, Berlin bureau chief before he left the Times in 2006. Most interestingly here, he wrote The Coming Conflict with China.
Yes.
Back in 1997, he saw this with Ross Munro.
That's right.
This was really amazing. And last thing I'll just say here, in a dispatch from Beijing, where he'd been sent soon after the Tiananmen massacre, he quoted a saying used in Imperial China to persuade people to inform, quote, "For the sake of the great cause, destroy your loved ones." Right? And by the way, that's from Roger Cohen's moving obituary in the New York Times. Anyhow, I won't say more except he was a good friend of mine, and he died 2 months ago. I'm sad.
Yeah, these are big losses. This is the generation of American reporters who covered Tiananmen. So they were, and so many great journalists like John Pomfret,
yes,
remember Mike Chenoy of CNN.
Yes, he was in my class at journalism school at Columbia. Yeah. I believe. Yeah.
And Dan Rather.
He still lives in Taiwan, I think, Mike Chenoy.
He's in Taiwan. I saw him there not too long ago. Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dun covered that story, and are still working. But we're losing some of the those reporters from that period. If there's a bittersweet thing, I guess it would be that most of the demonstrators were younger than the American journalists who covered them, and they are actually, they're in middle age now.
Yeah.
And they are still China's greatest hope, is the generation that demonstrated in Tiananmen Square and in scores of other cities across China in 1989. They are the last generation that really remembers the promise of what could have been. And it was actually a more liberal time for China in the 1980s than it certainly is today, under this almost, as the former party school instructor in exile, Cai Xia, calls it exquisite totalitarianism. She doesn't mean that as a compliment. It is that it is such a oppressive surveillance state that people just leave, or they have to stay in that system. But you don't. There's very little space to agitate to try to change the system from within. But the Tiananmen, that generation did show up, and they remember. They know what could have been, and they are still China's greatest hope. And they've still got a few decades.
There is a couple of questions in my mind. For one, why did they think around 1989 that there was this possibility that if they came out and demonstrated for freedom and for democracy, and they were very specific about that kind of thing, that they could get away with that, and in fact, that they could change the society? Was it because of changes in the Soviet Union around that time? Was it because the Cultural Revolution? People, I mean, why did they have these expectations?
Part of it was just the trauma. They were still only 10 years out from, 13 years out from Mao's death,
right,
in 1976. And that was finally the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. Millions died during that period. Tens of millions died during the Great Leap Forward before that. So this was a generation that was deeply disappointed, but also had gotten a taste of liberalization. The Soviet Union played a role in this sense as well, because remember, Gorbachev was visiting Beijing. It was there had been the Sino-Soviet split for decades,
right.
And in fact, Gorbachev was visiting Beijing during these demonstrations,
right,
in 1989, and people held up banners saying the true reformer is Gorbachev.
Well, he was. I mean, he had glasnost, which means essentially openness, transparency. Perestroika, which means sort of
reform,
rebuilding, but a limited market-like reforms was sort of the idea behind it. He was trying to save communism and save the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And this was also around that same time, but of course it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union instead. And my understanding is, not least from you, that the Chinese Communist Party leaders, call them what you want, thought we will take a different path. Opening up is not the way to go. We will shut down. We do not want to reject Stalin, and we do not want glasnost and perestroika. We want, but they may have, the young Chinese freedom demonstrators may have thought we want what they're getting in Russia, a more open society and more freedom.
Yeah.
But I guess the Communist Party leaders said, and that's just not, we're not going to let you get that.
Yeah.
We know.
Well, there were senior leaders who were in favor of moving in that direction. Notably Hu Yaobang, who had died a couple years earlier. He'd been sidelined. And it was actually his death in mid-April that triggered the Tiananmen demonstrations.
Mid-April of 89.
Of 89, they were mourning him. He had been purged a couple years earlier, pushed into retirement. His successor was Zhao, who was the general secretary, but he was not the paramount leader. That was still Deng Xiaoping. And Zhao made a mistake, among others. One, he went to he followed through on a visit to North Korea, of all places, in the middle of the demonstrations. And it was at that time that others colluded really against him to get to Deng Xiaoping and to cast the demonstrations in the worst possible light, to say this is, American black hands. This is they're gonna cost us the whole system, and really kind of whipped Deng into a lather, and he ultimately approved the very harsh measures that ended it in a sea of blood.
Which is interesting, and it's always been a little puzzling to me, because I think of Deng Xiaoping as being more open than a lot of Chinese rulers have been. But in this case, he thought,
was still,
no, this is
he was a hard ass.
He was a hard ass.
I mean, he was someone who borrowed and ran with some of the experimental reforms that were really led. Bob Sutinger's new book, which is a very interesting read. I reviewed it for the Wall Street Journal just a few months ago. But it is Huiyaobang. It's called Huiyaobang, the conscience of the party.
Right.
And Hu was the one who did some of the earliest experiments with agrarian reform. Basically allowing the market to rescue the rural sector.
Right.
And Deng sort of kept his distance, watched, and saw that there was success with this, and then really co-opted the reform agenda, but it never extended to politics except in narrow senses. Deng did not want a return of Mao Zedong's cult of personality leadership, so he did work to strengthen a little bit more of a consensus-driven model, but he was not in favor of anything. In fact, the way that he put it, according to Zhao Ziyang's memoir, was he said, "There shall not be any trace of parliamentary democracy. We shall never have any trace of Western democracy." So he was still a Leninist, but one who was bold enough to see that if they didn't adopt some market measures, they're just going to be left in the dust.
Right. And George W. Bush was president at that time. And tell us a little bit about his reaction. He kind of condemned it, but then got soft on it.
George H.W. Bush had been had actually been our de facto ambassador to China
earlier,
right? Yeah. And after he had served in the UN as our UN CIA director, but he did this stint before. I guess that was before he was CIA director, right? Where right after Nixon's opening, not long after that, he became the American emissary on site.
Right.
His sons were there. George W. Bush, who later became president, so I think that might have been his first overseas travel, was spending time with his folks in China. But there was an opportunity, I think, to put the regime in a much tougher position after it had shot upwards of 1,000 students and other peaceful demonstrators. But the Bush administration opted instead to try to salvage. They imposed sanctions. It was really sort of the end of the U.S. military cooperation with China, which was actually underway in the 80s. We were helping them build F-16s, a Chinese sort of knockoff of the F-16. The U.S. was helping them build that.
Why were we doing that?
Because of the Soviets. This was triangulation. Continuing on, we had a listening post on the border with CIA and the Chinese intelligence services listening for nuclear activity in the Soviet Union. So a lot of that began to wither, and there were sanctions basically allowing China to acquire weapons from Europe and the United States. But National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft was sent to try to prevent the relationship from going into a total tailspin. And he went and met with Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping blamed the United States for the Tiananmen demonstrations, which whether he truly believed that or not, I think to some degree they convinced themselves of some of that propaganda, even though it was absurd. Talk about an organic
Yeah.
sort of demonstration. The United States was as surprised as anyone. But but he said, look, we want to salvage, put a floor under this thing, and it wasn't too long after that American businesses started coming back, and that was because, look, the timing was just a little bit off. If the Berlin Wall had fallen in the spring of '89, and the Tiananmen protests were in the fall instead of the other way around, I think it might have been the end of communism in China. But instead, it was just a few months before the Berlin Wall, right? And it ended in bloodshed. And we thought the Soviet Union was still going to continue for decades. And so that triangulation strategy was something that George H.W. Bush wanted to salvage, and so he sent his emissary to go, put a floor under the relationship.
And would you have an estimate of how many students and protesters and were killed? This number, you think in the I know we don't know for sure.
Yeah, many hundreds to low thousands is what people say. Now, when I was a reporter in China writing for the Wall Street Journal, I broke a story of a letter from Dr. Jang Yong, who was a PLA surgeon who had also been the whistleblower who blew the whistle on the first SARS pandemic in China, that there were cases in Beijing. But I was given his letter that he wrote on the 15th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, calling for the party to reassess publicly its role in that travesty. And he wrote very movingly about treating students who were brought in that day, and he described an absolute bloodbath. He had kids wheeled into a military hospital where he was a surgeon. He was there to plug holes and try to save lives, and it was just cartload after cartload after cartload of wounded civilians. So he he's a brave guy. He put everything on the line to make that.
And did he survive having written that?
He spent a lot of time at home after that. House arrest for a time. I think he was brought up to a sort of a camp outside Beijing, but eventually was allowed to go back home. But it was an act of conscience. That was on the 15th.
Well, not everybody survives an act of conscience in China.
Yeah.
So
he carried enormous moral authority as a surgeon and as someone who had blown the whistle on the SARS outbreak.
So then we go to fast forward a little bit to 2001, and Clinton was pushing for this for some time, that China should get most favored nation status and join the World Trade Organization.
Yeah.
And I understand, by the way, from my reading on this, at least, there was bipartisan agreement that this was probably a good idea, that if we help, I think the theory was, and it's a good theory, but it's been tested a few times and found lacking, that if we can make say China or another place richer, more wealthier, it's going to liberalize. It's going to moderate. If people have some money, they're going to ask for other things, and their rulers will say, well, why not give it to them? Of course, people who are richer, they want a little more. And that was sort of the thesis that was being tested. And Clinton said, I'm all for, he was very much for it. But I think we have to acknowledge that Communist China got richer through our help, and through other things they did, good things and bad things, including stealing it. But just the opposite, it did not moderate. It got to where it is today.
It did. You just reminded me. If I were, you just gave me an idea for a newspaper column. If I were writing one,
you can write op-ed,
which would be to look at those, that minority of Republicans and Democrats who said this is the wrong idea at that time.
Were there some? I don't remember.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah? There were Chris Smith. Right. Chris Cox, I think, as well. Look, I can't do everyone justice. It'd be worth reading that list. It wouldn't take too long to read it. Right. But there were ones on both sides of the aisle. I'd also give a shout out to my friend Bob Lighthizer, who was President Trump's first trade representative, and he was. I mean, if you read testimonies that and op-eds that Bob Lighthizer wrote in the late '90s, predicting everything that actually transpired, not the fantasy. And again, I'm not casting aspersions. I was a young journalist at the time. I was hopeful, as anyone, that this was going to lead to sort of unlock liberalism eventually. And it did raise the standard of living for a good part of the Chinese population. But it did not play out how we fantasized it would. Bob Lighthizer was one of those who said, here's what's really going to happen. We're going to end up hollowing out U.S. manufacturing and making communists rich. And you may end up sustaining the regime. I mean, man, I wish we had listened to Bob Lighthizer in those days and some of these other members of Congress. He wasn't a member, but he was on the scene.
Right. And before long, Xi Jinping begins to consolidate his power. And you've written a lot about this, but I want you to talk about it a little bit about what you did. Well, let's understand. You went and you understood that Xi Jinping had to be writing and talking about what he really believed, not in English and not in things that were readily translated, but he had 100 million Communist Party cadres who had to know what the agenda is and what the plan is. And so you said, as a Mandarin speaker, I'm going to figure out what he's saying. Yeah. And maybe you should tell us a little bit about what Xi Jinping believes is his and China's historical mission. I think that's the...
Well, friends and colleagues like John Garneau in Australia, Matthew Johnson, who you should meet sometime. He and I wrote one or two things for FDD over the past couple of years, and others did the work of going through these painful to read speeches. Which, as Simon Leys, the great Pierre Rickman, the Belgian sinologist said, reading Communist Party documents is like eating sawdust by the bucketful, right? but you have to do it if you want to find those slivers of insight. And Xi Jinping has been very clear from the very beginning. Right, 2012, right after he was made general secretary of the Communist Party, he gives a secret address about the lessons China has to learn from the collapse of the Soviet Communist Party. And the lesson is Gorbachev's a bad guy; he's a villain, and the good guys that they never should have turned their backs on were Lenin and Stalin. And so he implicitly implicates Khrushchev as a bad guy for having deigned to question Stalin's record. Stalin killed millions of his, of many of them close associates and senior party members and up and down the chain. And the lesson was, that was a form of historical nihilism. Once you start questioning the foundations of the party, Lenin and Stalin specifically, you're opening a Pandora's box. And so the answer for the Chinese Communist Party, the lesson is not reform faster, reform better. It is go back to the basics. Go back to the classics. Purging your fellow party members and trying to remain true to if not Marxism, then certainly the Leninism side of Marxism-Leninism, raw power and controlling what Xi Jinping in that speech called the tools of dictatorship. He basically said the reason the Soviet Communist Party collapsed was after Gorbachev did open Pandora's box with these reforms and these things. The party tried to apprehend him and put things right again, but they didn't control the tools of dictatorship. And by that he meant they did not have total control of the party, did not have easy, immediate control of the military and the security apparatus. They let, these ideas that you should let it become a state institution like any normal country would have, right? The Republican Party doesn't have a military, nor does the Democratic Party. The United States has one. In China, it's the party's military. There is no state military. So you're saying basically they loosened their grip on these levers of dictatorship. Next thing you know, a great party was gone, and then the Soviet Union collapsed along with it. So she was laying down the law. Like, this is I'm going back to the oldies, guys. And we should have paid more attention to that. It was a secret speech that some brave people leaked. We would have done well to index that speech much more heavily than I think sinologists and intelligence officers and other did, because it ended up being very prescient. And all of the speeches that followed, you follow this thread where she is saying our brand of socialism is going to rule the earth. It's inevitable.
Well, that's what I want you to get to, because it's not just about keeping control within the country, because this is not a policy of peaceful coexistence of communism in one country and there's capitalism in other countries. We can figure out a way to get along. It's very clear, and again, this is in a lot of your writing, that Xi Jinping has global ambitions.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important for Americans and Europeans to understand what those global ambitions are, because it'll if he succeeds, life in the West will be very different from what it is now.
How long people were skeptical that he had global ambitions. It's incredible. And now, quite helpfully, the fig leaf was blown away. He's using the language routinely that I want to build a community of common destiny for all mankind.
That sounds so lovely, a community of common destiny, but it'll be...
Yeah. Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum adopted the phrase and thought it was a wonderful sort of thing. It was basically calling for the end of sovereignty for nations and moving towards a hierarchical empire under Beijing. As you read Xi Jinping thought in the internal texts that like PLA generals have to study, they have to study textbooks on Xi Jinping thought. In those, it directly attacks the idea of national sovereignty and says balance of power is not what we're aiming for. We want a gross imbalance of power where everything is subordinate
to us.
And Xi Jinping thought explicitly in the internal text says we're going to unwind the Westphalian system. We're going back to destroy the 1648 treaties of Westphalia that created the idea of a modern nation state.
Right. The idea of the modern nation state, of people having self-determination. He's against all of that. He doesn't believe in that. It's a Western idea. It's not a good idea. That there'd be a Czechia and a Slovakia, and there'd be even a France and a Britain. No, that's not what he's talking about. And this idea of balance, it's very important people get this idea. You may want to elaborate on balance of power, because there are quite a few people, not least on the right, who I think are attracted by the idea of you have your sphere of influence. Why should we interfere with you in Asia? That's all you want, is your sphere of influence. And Putin just wants his sphere of influence in the former Russian Empire lands. That's not so. And we can have a sphere of influence here, and it'll include Latin America and maybe Greenland and maybe Canada. And that's our sphere of influence. And won't it all be nicely a balance of power? We'll all respect each other's spheres of influence.
That is delusional thinking on par with our idea. In fact, it's a worse idea than the idea that maybe we can enrich China and they'll end up being kinder in general. That turned out to be delusional. This is an even greater delusion, because Xi Jinping has expressly told us already that is not what he's aiming for. He's not aiming for a sphere of influence. No. He's going for the whole dang thing.
Right.
And so he has all of these initiatives that he's unveiled over the past couple of years. They're all called global civilizational initiative, global security initiative. That was unveiled at the Shangri-La Dialogue a couple of years ago by a since purged, general. who was the defense minister, but nonetheless, the ideology still holds. It is to dismantle U.S. Alliances,
Right.
and replace it with a Sinocentric thing, Asia for Asians,
And not just Asia for Asians. Again, I think though it's another self-delusion. That's the first phase, right?
And the other is start destroying NATO, and the Communist Party is smart enough to use other kids' blood to do that. That's where the Russians come in.
Well,
they've got this guy Putin who's willing to fight. In fact, in those Xi Jinping internal texts on Xi Jinping thought in 2018, they predict it lays it out what's going to happen in Ukraine. It says Putin is getting ready to go aggressive against Europe and essentially drive a stake in the heart of NATO. And they're saying this is our moment. This is great stuff.
And this is great stuff.
So that's why China is the decisive enabler, to use the term that NATO officially uses now to describe their role in supporting Putin's war.
So there's 2 points there I want to get at. One is your assessment of how Xi Jinping sees Putin, with whom he has now a no-limits partnership and has since just before the invasion of Ukraine. I don't think that's coincidental, comrade, right? There's that. And also, we'll start with that, and then I'll try to remember the next question.
Yeah,
I might be able to.
Do you remember there's a period, the first summer of the full phase of war. So they invaded in February of 2022.
Right.
By late 2022, when there was a time when the cameras were rolling and caught Vladimir Putin beginning to explain himself in a meeting to Xi Jinping, they were in Central Asia together. And he was caught on camera saying, "Now I know you've got concerns about how things are going," and then the camera, they get pushed out. The press leapt to the most optimistic and wrong-headed conclusion, which was that Xi was unhappy with the fact of the war, when in fact what Xi was almost certainly expressing was he didn't think that Putin was fighting it effectively enough and needed to pick up.
He wasn't. He was
pick up his game. Like, get your game on.
Well, he was supposed to win in a few weeks, as most Western analysts thought he would. 2 reasons he didn't. One was because the Russian army wasn't up to snuff, and 2 is the Ukrainians fought like banshees and have been ever since. Because they don't want to be dragged into being ruled by a czar in the Kremlin. But okay,
that's right. Matthew Johnson and I wrote a piece for FTD at the time, trying to warn readers: don't believe the newspaper headlines that are saying, "Oh, things are starting to unravel between these two." I said, no, this is a marker that's probably going to foretell Xi Jinping doubling down. And sure enough, you fast forward another 5-6 months, Xi Jinping flies to Moscow in March of 2023, and that is the moment. The statistics would later show that is when Chinese support for the war machine absolutely skyrockets. Everything that Russia, just about everything they need, starts flowing in en masse at that point. And Xi was captured on video leaving the Kremlin, where he said, you and I are the ones driving world change now. You and I are the ones driving it, not just exploiting, situation, but we're now driving the chaos that we need to dismantle the world order in order to rebuild it in a Sinocentric hierarchy.
This is something people often don't understand, that there always has been in a certain way a world order or an international system. I mean, but it's like a fish not being aware of water. People just don't know that there is one. And when they're in, almost everybody doesn't remember anything different, maybe before World War II. A few people do. But it's the post-war World War II system that came out of Roosevelt and Churchill and the Atlantic alliance, and this is what Xi Jinping wants to destroy and replace with something that will be Sinocentric,
a community of common destiny,
right, based in Beijing. Now so there's 2 points. One is that and people don't get this either, a lot of people don't get this, if Putin should succeed in Ukraine, I think the chances that he would say, that's fine, I can retire now, are very slim. And it's not what Xi Jinping would want from him, because what does Xi Jinping want? It seems to me it's obvious. He wants NATO to collapse. Won't that be in his interest? And how do you collapse NATO? Well, it's not hard to see. Perhaps you just go into Lithuania. Now you've attacked a NATO member.
Mm-hmm.
Do Americans fight for Lithuania? Do Turks fight for Lithuania? I don't think so. There's reports today that he's getting aggressive towards Moldova, which is not NATO, but it just shows where he's going next. I had dinner last night with an ambassador of a Baltic nation, and he says, "Oh, they're already threatening us. I mean, they're on our borders threatening us right now. We know that if Putin should succeed, he's coming for us," because the Baltic nations were part of the Soviet Empire and previously part of the Russian Empire as well. And again, I've been arguing this for years. Putin sees himself as the Tsar, and his mission is to restore the Russian Empire. I don't know that he necessarily likes Xi Jinping, because Russians traditionally are very fearful of the Chinese, and he has probably reason to be, but that's 20 or 30 years hence, if you see what I mean. But he needs that now. And what you end up with here, again, is something we've been talking about here at FDD a lot, what we call the axis of aggressors, a couple of years ago called the axis of tyranny, whatever. People, a lot of people are using phrases along these lines, which is the idea that you have this Sino-Russian alliance, but also bringing in the Islamic Republic of Iran, because they have common interests, anti-American interests, not least, and of course, North Korea. So, now, and what that also suggests to me, and you've talked about, we like to think we won the Cold War. That's true if the Cold War was America versus the Soviet Union. That's not true if the Cold War was free market and liberal economies versus communism, since the strongest, most powerful communist party in history now exists, and it's based in Beijing, and it's made common cause with Russia, with North Korea, with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And that is the contest we're in, according, again, to Xi Jinping. So his what I would like to call his inaugural address was a secret speech that he delivered on the 5th of January, 2013, where he lays it all out. That speech was kept secret for 6 years. And he lays it out, and he says that this is, he's basically, again, bucking them up the Central Committee and just saying, don't lose sight, because Marx and Engels, their analysis was right, that the contradictions of capitalist society are going to destroy capitalist society, and our brand of socialism, single party dictatorship, is going to become not just survive in China, but become the global norm, that, capitalism would perish from the earth. So that's China likes to say, hey, don't have a Cold War mentality. It's because they are, they're literally don't want us to notice that they're waging a Cold War for the soul of humanity right now.
Right. And what we talked about before, the post-World War II system, it does have to a certain extent, America has a kind of benevolent hegemon. I think that's only fair to say, and that irks the French or the Germans, so they vote against us at the UN. But we allow them to do that. We don't, do. China sees Beijing. Xi Jinping sees himself and the Chinese Communist Party as the global hegemon, and I don't think it'll be nearly as kind and gentle a hegemon in the future if it takes over. And I don't think people realize that. And then there are also those, again, friends of ours on the right who are sort of isolationists or restrainers who say, it doesn't really matter if China takes over Taiwan. That's not an existential threat to us. The world is much more interconnected today than it is at other times. Sony Pictures is not going to make another movie with a North Korean villain in it after what North Korea did after that movie, The Interview. They know that. We've had what we believe to be essentially Chinese communist police stations in other countries, including the United States, setting up to make sure that both Chinese citizens and those who are not Chinese citizens but are nationals are not contravening the national interest of the People's Republic of China. I'm right on that, aren't I?
Yeah.
So that that does so again, we may have we don't know that we've won the Cold War. Is my point on that. That brings up some subjects in the news. One is, as we record this today on the 4th of June, there's stories about about a fungus among us, the smuggling of a pathogen into the U.S. by two Chinese nationals working at the University of Michigan. They were arrested. This fungus has decimated crops around the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's at least a suspicion that this could have been an act of war. If you want to destroy the U.S., bring in a pathogen that destroys American agriculture, you'll weaken the U.S. a long way with that.
I'd like to see the full indictment. I saw the statement about it. That's a Communist Party member, and at least one of them was identified as a CCP member. That some of their information had turned out to have been falsified, passport numbers that didn't match, and things like that. And yes, they brought in pathogens that have been identified as a potential bioterrorist agent to wipe out rice and wheat crops. And so it just raises the question: why are they bringing this in? And was it to illegally? Clearly, but Secretary Rubio has stated that he intends to begin vetting visitors who are CCP members and kicking out people who pose a threat or have direct CCP ties or are CCP members. So,
but this is a difficult question because I'm not eager to see Chinese students banned from coming to this country. A lot of them become American citizens, and they speak Chinese, and they're become very loyal Americans. At the same time, it's very hard to know, and you could say, well, we don't want them to be Chinese Communist Party members. But first of all, the Chinese government is not eager to pay for you to go to Harvard if you're not a Chinese Communist Party member. And under Chinese law, as I understand it, as you have explained it to me, if you're a Chinese citizen, and maybe even if you're of Chinese background, according to the Chinese Communist Party the Chinese Communist Party, you owe your loyalty to Beijing, and that will be enforced by them. You do not get to say no. And if you have family members back in China,
to put pressure on the family.
They'll put pressure on the family members.
So
here's what we need from your nephew or your son at Harvard or MIT. It's a difficult situation.
This might be an opportunity to think boldly about how to revamp our China visa policies in a way that tries to actually continue enticing Chinese scholars who are not CCP members to come to the U.S., but also give them green cards. So like set up a system that encourages them to stay and maybe even allow immediate family to come with, or at least an easier pathway to come, while screening out CCP members, unless they're defecting, right? If they're coming to sort of give up their CCP membership and defect. But I'm with you. I mean, there's a great number of students who have stayed in the United States, hundreds of thousands, in order to start businesses and become citizens. But I do think it's a fair question to ask, which is, to identify whether they are CCP members. We would want to know if someone coming in from another country. You know, it was someone a Ba'athist Party member who's coming
Well,
in?
I don't think the administrators at Harvard do care. I think they say, "Oh, that's great. You're a Ba'athist Party member.
Yeah, well,
we'd love to have you."
Harvard's a hopeless case.
And Columbia is a hopeless case. And University of Pennsylvania is a hopeless case. Maybe I don't know.
Well, look, I remember I was reading Bob Edwards' biography of the great Edward R. Murrow. Speaking of journalists again, Bob Edwards was the NPR Morning Edition reporter.
Right.
He wrote a terrific piece or book about Edward R. Murrow. Edward R. Murrow, before he became a household name as a broadcaster, for CBS, and then the first real television personality.
Yeah.
In the 1930s, he was helping place persecuted scholars from Europe in the United States. The group, I think, was called the Emergency Committee to Aid Displaced Scholars. Right. And by the way, many of these scholars, persecuted in Germany, in Austria. Some of them were Jewish, some of them were not. Then eventually, Italy and Czechoslovakia. Many of them went on to win Nobel Prizes and to help us win World War II.
Right.
These were the guys who built the bomb. Some of them, but Edward R. Murrow was I recall from the biography that he was frustrated because Harvard University was maybe one of the very few universities that refused to take any of these scientists,
really,
because they didn't want to offend the Nazis. So this is so here we are again.
Talk about a tarnished brand.
Did you see the Wall Street Journal piece about how in Beijing they refer to Harvard as the party school?
The party school, because it's the Communist Party school.
Communist Party goes there to brush up and get a promotion when you come back, and it's
and to learn about the U.S. so they can fight the U.S.
That's right. So anyway, Harvard's got some soul searching to do, but this isn't.
Well, they're not doing it yet, but so that's really dangerous. All right, few other subjects before I let you go. Chinese economy. I've seen some reports that it really is in terrible shape, and Xi Jinping is a lot of the reason, because he's at the helm and he's doing the things that rulers do to large countries, and economies don't flourish that way.
Yeah. Do you know Nick Eberstadt?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, brilliant guy.
Totally brilliant. And I was speaking to him recently. He did decades ago a lot of work on trying to unravel the mystery of why did the Soviet Union, why did it collapse, and why was the health of Soviets absolutely third world? Really, really poor outcomes, low.
Well, I can tell you from the time I was an exchange student there, people drank bad vodka a lot.
Yeah.
It was very hard to get fruits and vegetables. You were eating potatoes and butter and very often not. I mean, it was a very unhealthy environment.
But one of the things that seemed to accelerate all of that was just a sense of national pessimism that Nick has described to me from his research. And what I found really interesting was he was talking about how he's seen signs of this in China now. This sense of in some cases grave pessimism. And it's everything from the examples of students who just sort of passively rebel against the system by lying flat is the phrase. Just
lying
we're not going to participate. We're just going to be slackers now. We're not.
Well, the Russian phrase was, as long as they pretend they're paying us, we'll pretend we're working.
Yeah. Exactly. So you've also got John Fitzgerald in Australia wrote a piece well worth reading about the phenomenon of deep sea fishing. What is this? Deep sea fishing. This is a phrase that the local governments in China are so strapped for cash because the economy is crap. They're not bringing in enough revenue. They can't. The property market has collapsed, so they can't sell property, which was the main form of income for local governments. So they send their local police forces to the coast to visit rich companies and threatened to arrest or actually arrest senior executives as hostages to say you need to pay dues
Really?
back in from 1,000 kilometers into the interior. So these expeditions, the cops show up, they get a squad, they rent a car and drive 1,000 kilometers, and then they shake down wealthy businesses by accusing them of having violated some regulation, in central Henan province. And so this is so common that, one newspaper stuck its neck out to claim several tens of thousands of cases just in one city alone of people getting arrested or shaken down because they work at nominally private companies to go basically pay into the coffers of distant local broke governments. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff going on. There's a lot of frustration. A lot of people, a lot of people who are of means have left China. I have a Chinese friend who jokes that China's biggest export is entrepreneurs, and so we'd be wise to try to capitalize on that, and so we've got to be careful with these visa policies. But back to what I was saying, I do think it's a fair question to ask and know who are the CCP members, because CCP members have to swear a secret oath that, it is even Osama bin Laden, who you've got a doll up there. So
Osama bin Laden.
I read through bin Laden's, when I was a Marine intel officer, I read through a lot of his correspondence that was captured in the SEAL raid in Abbottabad.
Oh, yeah.
And even bin Laden had had enough of a sense of integrity, if you will, that he said, "Look, our fighters, our terrorist fighters, who are going to kill the distant giant, the United States, should not become citizens because it would violate." They've already taken an oath. They've taken an oath to Al Qaeda, and it would be dishonest and contradictory. The CCP is perfectly fine with members who've sworn the secret oath to always serve the party's interests as the paramount interest, but they can become American citizens as long as they don't really mean it with that oath. So, look, the Communist Party members are about, you said at the beginning, it's about 100 million. That is a hell of a lot of people, but it is still a small fraction. It's whatever, less than 10% of China. So we've got a 90% pool to draw from, and to make the United States a place where those who do choose to come here and who we think show a penchant for wanting to build a good life and serve a free society and its ideals. Let's let them thrive here.
Okay. Let's hit a few other subjects while we can. TikTok. It should Congress voted. The Supreme Court spoken. It should be banned by now.
Yeah, it should.
I mean, because it is
only if you believe in the rule of law.
Only if you believe in the rule of law, and also if you understand what TikTok is attempting to do in terms of both intelligence gathering and algorithms that are meant to convince credulous young Americans of various things that aren't true in the world, but are useful for the Communist Party of China to have them believe, which is, I think, what they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, anyhow. So, well, that's
all
look, right.
The legislature.
Yeah.
We've got three branches.
Yeah.
God bless them, right?
Yeah.
And the first branch, which is our legislature, passed a law, overwhelming majority, Democrats and Republicans together, to say, this is very simple. TikTok's welcome to continue operating so long as it is not controlled by a Chinese company that is beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. And as long as the algorithm, that addictive algorithm that feeds the content mysteriously what it chooses to feed, as long as that is no longer the Communist Party controlled algorithm, regulated algorithm either. And so the Supreme Court was asked to weigh in on this. They voted 9-0 that the law was constitutional. And instead, we're left with a very, very unfortunate situation where the administration is trying to save TikTok without forcing this part of satisfying the part of the law at a minimum, the part of the law that says the algorithm can no longer be Communist Party controlled. So what you have is an assault on free speech, an assault on the First Amendment by our government, because in rescuing TikTok, they are endorsing government control of speech in the United States, except it's the Chinese government. So if you are for TikTok, you are for government control of free speech. There's no other way to look at it. But because it is those algorithms, which have party input. Remember, the Chinese Communist Party has senior officials in the parent company, ByteDance,
Right.
And their titles, in addition to being Communist Party secretary and deputy secretary, they're also editor-in-chief and deputy editor-in-chief of ByteDance. Okay. So if you are saying, okay, that's all right, we'll let those guys decide what content is amplified to more than 100 million Americans and which gets suppressed. And we've seen that stuff is grossly skewed on TikTok in ways that content does not trend in the same ways on American platforms. To say that, yeah, we're comfortable with that. We're gonna ignore the law. We're gonna ignore the Supreme Court and allow TikTok to continue being controlled by the Chinese Communist Party means that you are endorsing government control of speech in the United States.
But a government can, under the Communist Party of China, control. That's really bad. All right, a few other quick subjects. North Korea. There was a time when I think the Beijing was sort of embarrassed by North Korea, but with now that North Korea is, Kim Jong-un is best buddies with Putin and supplying 155 millimeter artillery shells, all he can eat, plus all the bodies wrapped in uniforms that he wants. Maybe what is their view of North Korea now? A useful partner?
Yeah, it's funny. Beijing during the first Trump administration, I think President Trump did a very good job of making the best of an impossible sort of situation. You've got a country that's already acquired nukes and is testing long-range missiles to demonstrate the ability to deliver those nukes here, right? And what President Trump did was, so many people scoffed at this, but I think he did the right thing. He turned the formula on its head. The formula for 30 years of American diplomacy before then was you send these sort of mid-level bureaucrats to go in and negotiate with mid-level North Koreans and then threaten sanctions, but then pull the sanctions back in exchange for sort of to bring them to the table or get some kind of a promise that they never deliver on, and then we repeat the cycle.
Yeah.
President Trump said, I'm going to talk to the guy at the top level because he's clearly the only one who can make decisions. Yeah. Why are we talking to mid-level Korean bureaucrats? It's hilarious. But I'm not going to ease up on sanctions. In fact, I'm going to quadruple down on sanctions. But then keep the door open to talk. So at a minimum, he wasn't able to denuclearize North Korea, but what he was able to do was deprive that economy of significant inflows of hard currency that it would have devoted to its missile and nuke programs. I remember seeing some estimates that North Korea's percentage of its GDP that it spends on its military is like 35%, right? The United States is 3%. So all this money's going into illicit things and weapons. So why not just starve that system of cash? China saw that Trump was serious and played along with us for a while.
Right.
Over the course of 2017, China co-sponsored with Nikki Haley, who was serving as our ambassador to the UN, I think 4 UN Security Council resolutions that systematically increased sanctions and deprived that regime of money. We even got China to agree to cap the amount of oil it would send to North Korea. There's that was a close call, but we got them to do it. But once President Trump began his diplomacy with Kim directly, China got very nervous at that. The idea that the United States was going to, for the first time ever, have the leaders meet. And so she sort of leapt to try to preempt that and bring Kim into the fold and warm that relationship and start violating the sanctions that they'd agreed to at the UN. Even so, I think the President Trump's approach worked better than what previous presidents had done.
Yeah, although he wasn't. I mean, I think Trump always thinks there's a deal, and people want, if I'm going to give you beach resorts, that the view that everybody deep inside is homo economicus, everybody is a material girl, and that's just, and I think that's a mistake. I don't think any of these people are.
Some of the assumptions that that diplomacy were wrong, but it didn't turn out to be the disaster.
It may have been a reasonable, another reasonable experiment. Can I seduce Kim Jong-un? Can I get him to say, "Oh, I'd rather"?
And the answer is no.
And the answer is no. Yeah. We've had the experiments been run. Now we know.
In fact, it would have been suicidal for Kim. I think that Kim believes that if he were to actually bury the hatchet with the United States and with South Korea, what's the reason that such a regime even exists? I mean, he's had to impoverish for 3 generations, impoverish his people, eat tree bark at one point in the late 90s when everyone was starving to death there, and then to say, and all of it was nominally because it was in the name of protecting Korea from the Yankees, right?
Yeah.
And if suddenly he's shaking hands with the Yankees and saying, no, we're okay with these guys now. I think he's right in his assessment, that presumable assessment that the whole thing's going to unravel at that point.
And I do worry about this, that he is giving all this assistance to Putin. I'm sure he is getting something in exchange. What he's getting in exchange may be technologies that will threaten South Korea. I mean, and Japan, and after all, absolutely us. The Korean War did not end in peace or a path to peace. It's just a truce that's lasted 75 years. It's an armistice. That's all I think we should reasonably expect between Ukraine and Russia, by the way, is you might be able to, if there's significant pressure put on Putin, to get to an armistice that and a frozen conflict, essentially, which is what you have had for 75 years. But if Kim Jong-un gets stronger, he may think, before the end of my life, I want to succeed in my mission, which is to subjugate the South Koreans to my rule, just as Xi Jinping wants to subjugate the Taiwanese to his rule, just as Putin wants to subjugate the Ukrainians and all the former members of the Russian Empire to his rule, just as Ali Khamenei wants to be the hegemon of the Middle East and subjugate the Muslims and exterminate all those who are not Muslims.
This is what dictators do. And by the way, sometimes they tell us it's what they're going to do, and the Kim family regime is no different than that. They have pledged for 3 successive generations to unify. So if he has the means to do it, or believes he has the means to do it, we should expect that he'll try.
All right. So last subject, and just very quickly, Taiwan. How are you feeling about Taiwan? Are the Taiwanese doing what they need to do to protect their freedom and their democracy, or are you worried about that?
Well, it's interesting. There's a new TV series that is just airing now in Taiwan called 0 Day.
I saw the trailer for it when I was there last year. Yeah. I
haven't seen it yet, but I'm impressed with the premise, and I've heard it's
I saw some article about it recently.
This is an effort to start really coming to terms with the fact that just because the communists haven't invaded yet doesn't mean that they're never going to invade. And in fact, it's looking more and more likely that we're going to see a crisis, quite possibly on President Trump's watch. That crisis may not be an all full-blown war. It might be something short of war, an imposition of customs jurisdiction, a quarantine or something like that would still be extremely disruptive.
Admiral Montgomery, as you know, and Craig Singleton have run war games on exactly that premise. What if we're not seeing an amphibious landing? What if we're seeing a quarantine? What if we're seeing cyber attacks? What if we're seeing? And I was there with them last summer on this, and there were a lot of things that Admiral Montgomery and Craig gave the Taiwanese to think about very seriously.
Right. And now you've got an entertaining TV series that sort of looks at what it would be like if Taiwan were being invaded. And I think it's going to be a huge hit and success. And
I hope
it's going to change the zeitgeist in Taiwan. Hopefully, to help shore up the sorts of hard political decisions that need to be made. My sense is that President William Lai is very serious about wanting to strengthen defense. In fact, he's announced that he wants to exceed U.S. spending as a percentage of GDP. He basically wants to be the best ally. He's being stymied by the opposition-controlled parliament. But we should be engaging, both parties. The U.S. should be endeavoring to sort of help educate some of those in the legislature who think that, hey, if we're really, really weak, if we have a weak military, maybe Beijing won't notice us sitting over here 90 miles offshore. That's not how deterrence works. No. You need strength. Look at the example of Ukraine, talk about the Ukrainians are in many ways the best of Europe, right? These are the guys who have laid everything on the line to protect Western civilization. They're the ones who are actually out there fighting without true allies, right? Just with some support, but no alliances.
And they're fighting a common enemy, and it goes unappreciated, which you can see is terribly frustrating to Zelensky. He thinks I'm doing this. I'm on the front lines for you guys. Don't you understand that?
Right. Yeah. And most Americans do.
You think most Americans do?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I think the Republican Party is really gone into an Alice in Wonderland sort of place. I don't even think it's the majority.
Not the majority.
Party.
It's some. It's
a very vocal.
And some influential places within this administration, I would say. Listen, this has been a wonderful. It has been an enlightening conversation, as it always is with you. So thanks for coming by to do this.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for the work you do for FDD and all the work you've done and for your service, and then as a Marine, as a journalist, and as a great American thinker. I really do appreciate you here.
I'm so proud to be affiliated with FDD and enjoy every time I see you. So,
well, and thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation here today on Foreign Policy.